Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today, we're going to be looking at the recent political situation and renewed violent clashes in between warring parties in South Sudan. I'm joined by a very special guest, Daniel Akech. Daniel is a senior analyst, South Sudan, at the International Crisis Group. He's an expert and has done a lot of work on in that region, particularly on South Sudan. Daniel, I'm very, very pleased to have you join me today, and I look forward to a wonderful conversation.
I'm happy to be here.
So we've seen recent escalation in conflicts in the south of Sudan. What is behind this recent crisis? What is it about?
Thanks, Michael. It's been brewing, these tensions between the warring parties that came together in 2020 to form a coalition government after a civil war that ran between 2013 to 2018. By joining and coming together to form a government, they have been facing some challenges, which actually led to what had just happened. One of those challenges was the government was largely glued together by the access to oil revenues. And when the war happened in the neighboring country in Sudan, the government lost 70% of its revenues. And that actually created lots of pressures, which culminated in the president, Salva Kiir, president of South Sudan, is starting to restructure the government in three ways. One, he restructured the security sector. The security apparatus late last year, he started firing his long-serving security officials, and then he moved on to do the same restructuring within the party. And then lastly, he started restructuring the coalition government that was brought together by the peace agreements. By doing that, he sort of like overreached, and then that actually triggered what we have seen this month in some parts of South Sudan.
Okay, brilliant. That's a very neat summary of the situation. You mentioned something quite important. So South Sudan, the war in Sudan, you said has contributed largely to this. The 70%, a large significant amount of the revenue that's triggered this. But how is that? What is the connection? Can you explain that connection?
Yes, the South Sudan became independent from Sudan in 2011, and that was a political independence. The country remained dependent on Sudan for lots of economics needs, one of which is that the government of South Sudan relies on oil for 90% of its budget. And when the war happened in Sudan, it wiped out that entire oil income for the government. At least 70% was lost. And then not only that, the war in Sudan also impacted because South Sudan has 4 large states that are bordering Sudan, and they were relying on imports of goods from Sudan. That also was disrupted. And then there were almost 1 million refugees chased back into South Sudan who were originally South Sudanese who were kicked out by the civil war into Sudan in 2013. This large population returned to South Sudan, and the government of South Sudan has not yet recovered from its own civil war. So it was not able to address humanitarian emergencies, was not able to pay civil servants, organized forces for more than a year. And this has created lots of problems where the organized forces started to do extortions, and that triggered violence in local areas. And then when the civil war was happening in the 90s, 80s between the South and the North, South Sudanese groups joined, and they were used as proxy militias against their own movement. That link remained active, and they were reactivated by when the war broke out, because South Sudanese armed groups joined, desperate youth joined the warring parties and fought on both sides of the conflict. So that led to an influx of arms, illegal arms, into South Sudan in big. So those factors literally created a big problem for Juba. One is the economic meltdown, and then there was this increasing instability in the states. Those prompted the president to feel that his regime, his government, was insecure. So he had to make some moves, and those moves he made him and his government more insecure. For example, dismantling of the security sector made him insecure, and he had to invite a foreign government to rescue him. Also, dismantling of the restructuring of the party, as well as restructuring of the government, which came together because of a power sharing agreement in 2018. This is a violation. What he has done is a violation. He was called out by the opposition leaders, and when he finally decided to redeploy forces loyal to him to these states, such as Upper Nile, South Sudan has 10 states and 3 administrative areas. So when the local people heard that the president was making a move to redeploy forces loyal to him, the people there protested, and the accessibility to the weapons coming from Sudan transformed this protest to violence. And on the 4th of March, the militia groups in Nasser County in Upper Nile overran the government garrison towns, and that was the trigger.
Okay, that's something you mentioned. So let's go to the civil war in South Sudan, the 5-year civil war between 2013 and 2018 between the current Vice President Machar and Kerr. So now, if I link you up to what you're saying about the South Sudanese militias that acted as proxy, would you say somehow were they kind of attached to the Vice President's camp? So I'm saying this because I want to understand why President Kerr will feel the need to want to restructure.
Yes, the agreement itself. This is what the president is trying to do to reorganize and restructure the security sector comes from the agreement itself. The agreement or attempts to reject what the agreement says. The agreements put some provisions.
So you're talking about, to be clear, you're talking about the 2018 peace agreement.
Peace agreement, which brought them together. That agreement said that the forces that split when the civil war broke out in 2013, which split along ethnic lines. Presidents come from an ethnic group called Dinka, which is the largest ethnic group in the country. Vice President Riek Machar comes from Nuer ethnic group. And there are also 62 other ethnic groups inside the country. It's a diverse country. When that agreement was signed, it was supposed to reunify those forces that fought the war. That has not happened for 6 years. They have not been able to do that. The other provision was there was supposed to be a formula for sharing power, not only at the national level, but also at the states level among the parties that signed that agreement. That has not been going very well. There has been some violations, especially from the president's side. And then lastly, there was supposed to be a law of the land, constitutions, which should have been created. It hasn't been created. So the agreement itself has not been implemented because there is so much distrust issues between the president and vice president. So that was the context in which the president, because he has not been able to work with the oppositions to create a unified army. So what do? You try to disarm everyone and install your loyal troops throughout the country, and that actually went bad.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I look at these as so let's look at it in a more broader sense. I think South Sudan, it's that, well, I call it the tragedy of the African colonial legacy, where states, you see states are arbitrarily created and they have different ethnic states, and that quest to find a system that works for us. How do you see South Sudan in relation to that narrative? Do you think it's a victim of that, or do you think it has a peculiar story?
Yeah, it's a bit unique. The situation, the context also is very different for South Sudan, because it became independent from another African country. So it's the link back to colonial era, when we were seeing in the 60s and 50s, because Sudan was one of the first countries in what we call sub-Saharan Africa to actually become independent. But yes, it's facing its own war, which could maybe could be explained in the terms you are mentioning. But in the case of South Sudan, it's just an African country breaking away from another African country, and that, so it's a bit of a different context in that sense. Also, the way it broke out, it was not really elite agreements that actually broke South Sudan away. It was this public exercise. It was a democratic exercise that brought together a huge populations, percentage of people who voted to separate from Sudan in 2011. Countries that have been created like that in Africa are very rare. Where it's previously it was just elite sitting down talking with their bosses and agreed to declare independence. But in this case, it was the grassroots, the people declaring this independence. So that was expected to be very different. But of course, the whole process was hijacked by the politicians, and then the land from their colleagues in the regions and in the continent, and that we are seeing exactly similar episodes we have seen elsewhere. So it should not have been like this, but it's the same trajectory, unfortunately.
So if we look at it that way, so could we say the South Sudan case should be a cautionary tale to countries that are seeking secession, independence? We see Western Sahara, we see in Somaliland, we see in Cameroon, Ambazonia, we see even Nigeria, we see. Should this be a cautionary tale? And then again, the second part of that question would be, I would think in most cases that in Africa, it will be a challenge to that arbitrary state creation where distinct group of ethnic group want to form. But in South Sudan, beside the Dinka and the Nwankpa ethnic group, your sister has still another 62 ethnicity. So it's how do you explain that?
It's yes, I do not want to use South Sudan as sort of like an example to deny other African countries aspiring to express their freedom. That you cannot deny that, because it's not really what has gone wrong. It's not the aspirations of the people wanting to be free, wanting to exercise democracy in the way they did in 2011. That is not what has gone wrong. Also, what has not gone wrong in South Sudan is not the diversity that is the problem itself. Is the politicians dragging their communities into these conflicts and use them. And in fact, these politicians, once they fought, they could use the communities, but these communities, the armed youth that they exploit during the conflicts are never really part of the agreement. And this is one of the problems we are facing, where they are just left out in the communities, in the cold, and then the politicians go to the capitals and then they enjoy their resources there. So what is problem is the politicizations of ethnicities, of diversity that has gone wrong. What has gone wrong is the hijacking of these people's movement that came together to create these states. This is not a state that you could blame on pencils being drawn on the map by a colonial power. This used to be an argument, which is now no longer making much sense. South Sudan was not created like that. It was people coming together. 98% of voters voted to separate. If they knew there was a problem that they could not live together, they would not have done that. They could have actually rejected that, but they did not. They correctly decided that we want to be free, and that process was hijacked. And this has been the case, the same story all over places where youth had come up to overthrow dictators. For example, in the case of Sudan and other areas, it's usually the politician coming behind and hijack the whole movement and turn it into.
Unfortunately, I have there's a formula I have for it. I need to really write on this formula to make it popular. I call it the 10-80-10 formula. So the formula is there's the 10-10 are the elites. So there's a good elite. The 10% is the good elite. The other 10% is a bad elite. The 80% are the people which call the youth. Now, when there's a revolution, the French Revolution, the Arab Spring, the ones that are internally driven are by the 80%. But usually it's just like a head. You need a leader. So if the other 10%, the bad elite, capture that and hijack it, like if I use your word, then it's going to turn bad. But if the good one takes over, then we see something positive. So in the case of South Sudan, it looks like unfortunately the bad elites have captured this stuff. But now let's go into why it has been difficult to at least establish. I know you talk about mistrust and all that, to at least establish a constitution, because the idea of the constitution is it sets out the rules, the framework that will guide, the relationship. Why has it been difficult to at least get that piece of document that guides and prevents all of this mistrust?
The elites are not prioritizing programs that could take the country out of these stagnations. They are prioritizing their own calculations, their personal interests. And constitutions, what it does is actually make rulings, governance democratic. South Sudan today, if you are a governor, you are an MP, you have to be appointed by appointing authority. And this is not very good. Yeah. So the appointing authorities have so much power that you could actually hoard all the money of the country and decide to distribute them according to your wishes, according to your political interests. And that control, you will lose it if you actually come up with a constitution that will actually protect people's rights. And that's one of the biggest challenges now in South Sudan, is that people's rights have been violated. Even the idea of forces being paid. For example, this month they were attempting to pay organized forces. They were thankful, but they have not been paid for 1 year. That is actually their rights. It's not someone to decide whether you pay people or you don't. The same, if people should elect their own governors, that will reduce, will take actually governance and powers to the locals. The elites at the center have captured the power at the center, and they don't want to relent, because it's going to actually introduce democracy, which is something they will talk about, but they don't want to. South Sudan has been struggling to go to elections since it became independent. It's never happened. When you approach that, there is a big crisis. So that means elites are actually not prepared to let go. They don't want to allow that. And this also could be blamed on the history, the legacy of civil wars, of liberations. Back in the 80s, it was popular to see African countries, and even in the 70s, where the liberators want to liberate countries, which never really actually happened at the end. But that is really what they are struggling with. These people came from a background of fighting for 50 years. There on CVs, there is not much else that they could actually use to pursue peaceful means of transformations. It's always either the opposition want to use violence, or the ruling elites want to clamp down on oppositions using the same tools. So that is really what I see to be a problem in this context.
We'll come back to there's a question I was going to ask you, but I think let me just focus on the particular crisis. I'll come back to it. I'll come back to that. Let's go to the crisis itself. So how the crisis is developing. We saw where the UN helicopter was shot down and all of that. How do you see this conflict developing in terms of within that? And who is behind that? What factor? Definitely,
Yeah, we could go back to the storylines where I said that there was in late February, the president ordered redeployment of forces in this particular area. And then it was resisted, and then violence happened on the 4th. When that violence happens, the White Army, which is the local militia groups, which fought alongside the Vice President Machar in 2013, but sometimes they act as independent groups. They are not always taking orders from the main opposition groups. These groups overran the garrison town, and the government commander of the garrison town, the major generals who was there, locked himself in a tank. And then it triggered hostage situations in which UN was involved by the parties in Juba to try to airlift these stranded government forces in Nasser, the town that was overrun and captured by the White Army, the militia that overran that town. This process did not go very well. The UN helicopter came under fire upon landing in Nasser, and the general and his bodyguards were all killed, including a UN crew member from Ukraine was also killed in that situation. In Juba, the reaction was also moving in the direction of escalations rather as opposed to de-escalations. The president arrested officials from the oppositions, blaming the incidents in Nasser on the main opposition. So there was no separation, no distinctions between the community, the militia, and the main oppositions in Juba. And that actually escalated things. The following day, the president invited Uganda forces into Juba. And as soon as the Ugandan forces came, it revives the past memory of the civilians from the Nuer community being targeted in 2013 by the government in Juba. And Ugandan forces were also in town at that time. Also, it emboldens the presidents to also not pursue de-escalations, but rather go for escalations. The top generals loyal to the president have been threatening to retake Nasser. And yesterday night, they attacked opposition base near Juba, 30 kilometers west of Juba. And that was also an escalation. Within the Upper Nile regions, there are Ugandan forces, together with the army loyal to the president, have been carrying out airstrikes in civilian areas, including Nasser, including other 3 counties in which these bombardments had happened. Children and women had been killed. So this indiscriminate strikes that they've been doing is not helping the situation. It's actually encouraging the locals to see the government as a threat to be fought. And that is leading to escalations already so far in Unity States, which is neighboring Upper Nile states. Also, like in Upper Nile, we could see it as a flashpoints. In Juba itself, we saw yesterday where the Ugandans were engaged in airstrikes at this basis. When the agreement came together, the opposition was allowed to put their forces in some areas throughout South Sudan. Near Juba, there are 3 bases of the oppositions, and one of them was attacked by the government yesterday. So things have been moving in the direction of escalation as opposed to de-escalation. The other point, the other risk that could happen here is that South Sudan could become a black hole, drawing in neighboring countries into what could potentially be a regional conflict, because Upper Nile is neighboring Ethiopia and is neighboring Sudan. And forces, the militias, you asked me before about these militias in Upper Nile, if they are all aligned to to the opposition,
Mm.
vice president. No, they are not all like that. Some of them are aligned to the vice president. Some are independent, and others are also running their own opposition. They are under different politicians, although from the same community. So that force is seen by the government as hostile force. And then at the same time, the Sudanese government, which has been experiencing all these militias fighting on both sides of the ongoing war in Sudan, which began in April 2023, is also seeing Upper Nile as a problem because its own opposition forces are somehow seen as linked to Juba. So this could become a contested space, and Uganda is also seen as a strong ally of the main opposition fighting the Sudan Armed Forces in Sudan. It's called the Rapid Support Forces. That group is seen as strongly supported by the Uganda. And now Uganda has come to South Sudan. This is creating anxiety in Port Sudan. So this area, and also is too close to Ethiopia. So it's, if violence escalates in this particular zone, we could see regional conflicts coming together in that spot. So it's a big risk.
I'll come in a minute to talk about because in some conflict, you could see where external involvement, intervention can do either of escalating or de-escalating, prolonging conflict, or even making conflict, worsening conflict. But before I come to that question, you're using opposition, so I wanted you to briefly clarify what you mean by opposition. So there was a coalition government, and my understanding of the coalition government is one side, President Kiir and Vice President Machar form a coalition government. So are you using opposition in the current sense of the conflict, or when it's opposition, are you looking in the political sense? I wanted to just clarify that briefly.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's the context in South Sudan is very convoluted, because you have the Sudan's People Liberation Movement in opposition, which is a party of the vice president. This is the largest opposition party. It has been part of the government since 2020, but it continues to call itself oppositions. It's a contradiction. And then if you look at the side of the president, he has a party which is called the Sudan's People Liberation Movement. This is a party that was inherited from the old civil war. And then slash the SPLM in government. When everybody is in the government, and yet there is one faction, the faction of the president, calling itself the main faction in government. So this is all contradiction. So they are all part of the government, but they have been opposing one another. They are not working as a team. That is really the reality, and that's the sense in which I use opposition, is because that's the name they used to call themselves, the vice president. Okay. But there are other oppositions which are not heavily armed, and they are not always seen at the scene of this.
Okay, that makes sense. I wanted to clarify, but then we'll come again in East Africa. East Africa, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, has always been one that is prone to regional conflict. Whether it's the genocide in Rwanda, where you see there's several countries involved in it, whether what is going on in DRC, with DRC bordering Burundi, and then you see Rwanda. There's always been that element of intervention from neighboring countries. And then in DRC, we can begin to look at the interest. You can look at the minerals. What is the interest? So I remember in South Sudan, Uganda would say they're fighting the Lord Resistance Army that were in some of these other countries, or the AFD in these other countries. So what is Uganda's main interest in South Sudan?
There are two. One is the economics interest. South Sudan is actually sort of like an export market for Ugandan goods. South Sudan is landlocked, Uganda is landlocked, but it's still is very ironic that South Sudan relies on Uganda for imports. And that's almost 60% of cereals that are consumed in Juba comes from Uganda. This market is a monopoly, and it's one-sided trade, and it's benefiting mainly Uganda. South Sudan gets oil money, and then they go buy goods from Uganda. So this is actually a big stabilizing factor in northern Uganda, which has been a region has been always hostile to the ruling government. And these things is the main benefit that Uganda is getting out of this. And then the second one is actually Ugandan forces have been engaged in the regions as sort of like high-grade mercenaries. The reason I'm calling them high-grade mercenaries is because they are actually paid a lot more than what the government of South Sudan is paying its own national army when they are there. So they are not there on humanitarian ground. They are there as
regime protection.
Yeah, there you go. So they are making money. So this is beneficial. If you have your army paid by another state, that's really relieving you of any headaches, because look at South Sudan, it hasn't paid organized forces for 1 year, and what is happening now it's contributing to instability we are seeing. So this is actually beneficial to the Ugandan forces. Of course, it's not really helping peace in the regions, because Uganda is part of the IGAD, which is a regional bloc that is supposed to help with the fostering collaborations in the regions and protecting peace. Uganda is actually always you jump into South Sudan and then you take a side. So that is the interest of Uganda. But overall, on the questions of why is it always the case that there is an external interventions, part of it is actually the military resources. The manner in which these warring parties access military resources is always leading to needing external support. In South Sudan in the 60s, that was the case. In the 80s, it was the same, where you had all the regional countries and external groups also coming in. And this also brought in UAE in the case of Sudan, where they have been funding the rapid support forces. And so this is really the key is, where do you access your weapons once you are engaging as a non-state actor, or as a weak government threatened by these non-state actors? Where do you run to? Looking for someone to supply weapons or provide helicopters to bomb your citizens.
It's quite saddening that Africa, it's that seems like the sad story in many African states. But again, we're beginning to see, speaking of external involvement and how that can prolong, we also look at how that also can create an opportunity to either de-escalate. So we're seeing, I don't know if this applies. So twofold, this question is twofold. We've talked about Uganda's interest, but I could understand Sudanese rationale for how this conflict might impact them. But you mentioned Ethiopia as well, and other regions. I wanted to also touch on what could be the motivation for them and how they can intervene. But then again, I wanted to also look at the geopolitical competition, especially in the Horn and East of Africa, that is going on. Where you mentioned UAE, for instance, sponsoring the rapid support force in Sudan. We have other countries as well that are taking sides in all of this. But then again, how do you see where African countries can then leverage on these competitions, these geopolitical competitions? Do you see it as a necessarily evil thing? Or can there be a way where it can be leveraged in a positive way?
There is opportunity in every crisis. This could be exploited if you have good thinkers in the leadership, that there are investments. First, what is the interest in East Africa? In the case of South Sudan and Sudan, South Sudan is covered. White Nile runs through South Sudan, and there's been tensions in the regions that has Nile Basin countries on one side, and then there is always Egypt and Sudan together in the other camp. That is actually playing out in the tension between Egypt and Ethiopia, as well as South Sudan in October last year joined the rest of African countries to ratify a cooperation agreement, which Egypt did not take lightly. So in this particular case, South Sudan is seen by Ethiopia as sort of like aligned, their interests are aligned on this Nile water things. That's one. Egypt is already sort of pushing Ethiopia to the other end. So if Egypt is backing Sudan, obviously Ethiopia would actually look for ways to work
back
with the
those.
other. So that is one. And then Sudan itself is relying on South Sudan as well on oil flows. And then the populations there are sort of kind of overlaps in some spaces. So, and then it's facing oppositions because when civil war was happening between South Sudan and Sudan, the region was called Southern Sudan, and it included other areas, including Southern Kordofan was too close to Southern Sudan. Blue Nile was also too close to South Sudan, and then Abyei. So those areas were supposed to be viewed as part of what the Southern rebels were calling New Sudan. These groups, once South Sudan was cut out, they remained fighting, and they are still linked to South Sudan. So that is a security interest for Sudan to be worried about what is happening in South Sudan, because these opposition groups could link up with the RSF the way they are now, the Rapid Support Forces, and could create a front that could be problematic, and that is part of their interest. So mineral resources as well are there, oil interests, and then other types of minerals resources, and then the water. So there are lots of interests, and then the location I think is the key. The East African countries we're talking about are kind of placed in very strategic location that external actors are seeing as they want to create influence in those areas. So these competitors in the Gulf areas export their competitions to East Africa, and that's actually not very helpful, because it's always involving some kind of violence, and that's not very healthy for the regions.
It's before we come to the last question, I wanted to clarify that economic dependency between South Sudan and Sudan, because you said there's a political independence. So first, where does the bulk of the resources, where is it located physically, like the oil, or is it in South? What is the arrangement? Just clarify that bit, and then I'll ask you the last question.
So yes, when Sudan, part of the difficulty of separating South Sudan from Sudan was the location of oil. And actually, it's not really how people abuse resources that creates war. It's usually the location of oil. In this particular case, it was located in a sort of like a minority regions in southern Sudan. And then South Sudanese were viewing oil being extracted by the Sudanese government as our oil. So it's their oil that was being taken out. So the Sudanese elites in Khartoum were resisting. Why should we let these resources go with them? So there were penalties, lots of arrangements in billions of dollars that South Sudan had to pay to go. So they had to actually pay money to separate. And then at the same time, it became difficult because they had to transport the oil through Sudan, because that was the already infrastructure in place. And it's very expensive to create new pipelines. So they used those infrastructure that came from the old Sudan. And then in that process, they had to pay transit fees, they had to pay transportation fees. And then the Sudan was also benefiting from these other arrangements that in order for South Sudan to move, they had to pay for damages to the shocks that was coming from 80% of oil being taken to one side is something that had to be accounted for. So those were the real interests. That's really where the linkage remained very strong. South Sudan is trying to pull away, but if they don't solve this dependency on oil, they used to depend on oil for 90% of their budget. Now at least is about 88.9, but still that's
That's a lot.
Yeah, so that is really where the problem is, that they rely on too much. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So let me ask you for the last question. How do you see this crisis between the South Sudan crisis between President Kiir and Vice President Bashir? How do you see it playing out? What do you think it's going to happen? in the short, medium, and long term?
So things that the risk that the president has been taking and firing all these people, doing all these things, South Sudanese are reading this as maybe he has a plan, and his game plan is to create a path to eliminate rivals, so that his chosen successor could take over. That is how South Sudanese are reading what is happening. And it looks like the process is very risky, very violent so far, but it seems to be moving in that direction. And Machar, also, he's been in Juba. He's been in Juba since February 2020. He never moved out of Juba. He never moved anywhere inside South Sudan. So people are reading that as this guy is under arrest. So he doesn't really have a lot of cards to play in this particular case. But the overall situation, the populations is disgruntled. They are no longer happy. 20 years, nothing is done, no services delivered, government is absent everywhere, and when it shows up, it's violence. It's the context is always hostile, and that is actually something that could help Machar in a way that the populations might actually rise up to push back on. So that is the only cards that is also playing out. But it looks like South Sudan cannot really move on because these stagnations that has been seen is not really going to be resolved. Even we call regions to come together to say, like, what is the kind of peace we should be talking about? Is this the same arrangement where you bring Machar and Kiir together? And it has always failed. So there has to be a new thinking if South Sudan is going to get out of this nightmare.
Okay, let's hope it doesn't degenerate to the point where we have to having grave humanitarian crisis. But anyways, Daniel, thank you very much for offering us your time and your very, very deep insight and perspective on this issue. We're really grateful.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, really grateful. Yeah, you're welcome.
Sure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye. Have a nice day. Thank you once again for tuning in to this week's episode. As is tradition, which is join me to thank our guest, Daniel Akech, who's shown us to be very knowledgeable about the brewing or the growing ongoing crisis in South Sudan. For now, stay blessed, and I'll see you next week.